All right, in this session we're going to talk about transfer functions and gamuts in a little more depth and how they relate to comp. And I talk about this in some other sessions relative to like recreating color management without any color management using nodes to do it. Here I'm going to talk about how you actually get to creating those nodes. So we talked about transfer functions briefly in one of the intro sessions. I'm not going to go over all that, but basically it's mapping input output. It's a curve. It's showing what, converting from log to lin. Usually it manifests as some kind of curve like this, and a transfer function is usually defined by the manufacturer in a white paper. In this case, we are looking at vlog vgamut, and this is the math for taking a vlog image and linearizing it. So what we do, you can use an expression node to do this, is you can map, there's a couple ways to do it in an expression node, and if you are going down this rabbit hole, you've probably seen other expression nodes for other color spaces and other transfer functions, where people use, basically you can set variables here and define them. A lot of times you don't have enough spaces to set, like RA wide gamut 4 or RA log C4, for example. It has more variables than Nuke provides places to define them, so you have to basically collapse them into the expression itself. But this is basically what's happening, is we're going vlog to linear, and so we're taking this formula. In our case would be the channel, so it'd be R, G, or B. And then we are rewriting this expression inside Nuke using TCL syntax. That can be the tricky part sometimes, especially on, this is a pretty easy one from a, where we have a power function here. Luckily, like nomenclature wise, this is written out very similarly to how we would do it in Nuke. Sometimes they are written more traditionally, and so you just have to convert, you're using functions where they're using notation. But here we have our our cut point. So we're setting our cut point here, and that's where this curve changes. So you'll have, and that's how a lot of modern cameras are. They'll have a cut point where it's one formula before the cut point and a different formula after. So in this case, our cut point, it's somewhere around here. I can't remember exactly, but it's actually defined. So whatever the cut point is, 1.181. But that's what's going on in this expression. So we're setting our cut point, and then we have a little bit of logic here, and then we have the out point after that. So it's the power of 10, the n minus d divided by c. And so we've defined all those. FD, FC, FB. And then we have our cut 2 and a different formula which happens after this. And so that's that first part. So the n minus 0.125 divided by 5.6. It takes a little bit of holding your mouth right, especially if you don't come from a math background. I know for me, I know enough math to get into trouble, but not enough to know what I'm doing the first time. So it takes me a minute to usually do one of these right the first time, and I always try and find an analog or something I can base it off of to double check my math. I've had to do this a few times. So like D-Log is a good example. It doesn't exist in ACES, and occasionally we do get DJI drone footage in D-Log, and so we'll need to convert from D-Log to linear, and so we'll do that via expression node. Although it's a little easier now in ACES 1.3 because they have functions for generating camera curves with cut points. So it can be something more complex than just a gamma curve. But that's basically the guts of creating the transfer function inside of Nuke outside of color management, is using this expression node and double checking your syntax. The next thing you can do to generate the full color space is using color matrices to convert from one gamut to another. Because gamuts are 3D, you can use a 3x3 matrix to convert one to another. The easy way to do that is to go to color-science.org/apps, and there's a wonderful app on there where you can select your input gamut and your output gamut. We want it to be DJI. You can set it to output in Nuke. You can set it to output in OpenColor.io or just a string. You can set your chromatic adaptation. So there are different ways to transform one matrix into another. The chromatic adaptation defines that formula. There's different ways to do it. And if you actually click through these, you'll see that the values, they're usually similar, but they're not the same. Sometimes some of these can be quite a bit different, relative. And so you might tinker with this a little bit, but again, with this transformation, you can invert it. A lot of times I use Bradford or Cat2. But you can just take this code right here, copy, paste, and now you have a gamut conversion from ACES CG to DJI D-gamut. If you need to invert it, you can either invert them in the app and make a new one, or simply just hit the invert button, and now you have a pipeline that is the same. So that's a really nice, helps if you do it that way. So that's, you can get mathy and write these expressions. Again, tons of information out there on matrix conversions and chromatic adaptation transforms and the formulas that are used to do that. You can basically Google any one of these names and get a whole bunch of really detailed white papers on all this stuff. For me, I basically live on this page if I need transforms from one to another, if I don't have them already hidden somewhere. So that's kind of the meat and potatoes of like how to do it in nodes. You also might wind up doing it as a mix of different things. So another cheat with transfer functions is if you have access to an ACES 1.2 or older config, there's a LUTs folder that's usually contained sidecard with that. And in this case, like they have a vlog to linear SPI1D file. You can use an OCIO file transform node and just reference that file directly. So that will do your log transform for you. And then you can either use matrices or other means to get your gamut converted properly. And that's if you can't just do it directly with a OCIO color space node. That's really the easiest, best way, but we don't always have access to that, and so that's why it's important. That's why I wanted to frame this to show you there are other means to manage your color relative to your transfer functions and to your gamuts. If you're getting into OCIO configs, this is the vgamut color space and how it's set up. So in a 1.2 config, it's doing a file transform. It's referencing that vlog to linear SPI1D. And then it does a matrix transform. And this is different than the matrix. It's similar. Like if you look at this matrix and you look at this vgamut to ACES 2065, because remember, ACES is always moving to and from ACES 2065. So all the math under the hood is always going to 2065, and then it'll do a transform from 2065 to working space or display space or wherever else it's going. So if you look, these are matrices. This one is actually from the 1.2 config. And if you look, because I'm in ACES 1.3, and you look at the difference here, there's actually some very, very slight differences between what came out of this app, and it's because the chromatic adaptation is different than what ACES used to generate their matrix. So it's always worth, you know, understanding like where this is coming from and where it's going, because again, we can just invert any one of these that we use, or we can actually, you know, steal this matrix from out of the config if we have access to a config. You could copy and paste these values into a matrix like this and have it do some work. And it's also, so this is the same group but in ACES 1.3, and if you look at these matrix values, they're actually different than the matrix values that they use in 1.2. And this is why the ACES version that you use is also important, because they do vary slightly from version to version. So in this case, you can see like our first value, it's similar, but it's not the same. And if you diff those, you will, you know, you can actually see a little bit of a difference. Now, by a little bit, I mean you have to crank your diff gain up to 1,000,000. Very subtle differences, but they are a little different from config to config. And so that's a little, just a heads up. Again, a layperson's probably not going to see that difference, but if you are diffing things and you're trying to figure out why exactly it's not working, it's because they're using a different chromatic adaptation. That's what it appears like on my end. 1.2 uses a different chromatic adaptation than 1.3 does for this particular camera profile. So that's a little bit about that. We can get into, you know, these are the 1.3. And again, in 1.3, we don't have sidecar files. You can use sidecar files, but you don't need them necessarily, because we have a log camera transform option now where we can set our base, the slope, the offsets, and that allows us to basically generate what this white paper is giving us inside of the ACES config itself. You have to do some math to figure out what these values are in terms of the slope, offset, etc. But they can now be generated directly in the config without sidecar files, which is pretty useful. If you are using sidecar files, like in this case, we are using that OCIO file transform, where we're calling that vlog to linear SBI1D. This is what the guts of that actually look like. And it's just an index. So it says, all right, if the input is this, then the output is Y. And you can manually generate these. I've manually generated these before so that we could convert, build transfer functions for things that were more mathematically derived. And it's basically, you can set your values, your 0 to 1, how many notches it's going to have, basically, which is how many steps. And then, in some cases, like in the case I use Python to generate the output for, 496 different entries. I wouldn't recommend that, but it is an option. And then you can use a file transform to apply that hand-generated file. All right, so I think that's about it for the transfer functions and gamuts deep dive. Some good stuff there. Again, if you're getting into this, definitely check out the camera white papers. There's some good things there, and then crack open the OCIO configs. You can find a lot kind of sniffing through those, like seeing how they put the math together and how those work. I've pulled other stuff from the ACES repos where they have CTL files that have the math built in. Other people have written a lot of math for a lot of these, so you don't have to start from scratch either. There's usually other information out there. It's been converted into a format that's more TCL friendly, so if you are writing expressions or having to generate matrices, then there's a little bit of help out there.